today we're honoring veterans, their courage and their patriotism. And my grandfather served in World War I in France and was wounded. My father fought in Southeast Asia, in New Guinea. He was wounded. He was brought back to Brooklyn Navy Yard and stayed with his cousin who lived in Flatbush area, where he met my mother, and they eventually married after the war. So I'm 50% Brooklyn. So it's Veterans Day, and it's also a day when we can ask, why is there war in the first place? And how can we avoid war in the future? These are questions that Dorothy Day was asking 100 years ago when she was your age. Just as a brief, Dorothy Day is the only American woman that Pope Francis mentioned in his address to the U.S. Congress in September of 2015. And he talked about an activist for social justice, and the pictures that we generally have of her is of an old woman helping poor people. And somehow the relevance of that doesn't sink through as powerfully as it should. But Dorothy Day was once 19 years old and very aware of the injustices present in society. One of those was the war that was breaking out. I mean, it was already in full swing in Europe, and there were people in the United States who wanted to get involved. She was taking an opposite position. And so I put this, her first job in journalism was with the New York Call. It was the paper of the Socialist Party. And she worked there from roughly September of 1916 to April of 1917. So shortly after the United States joins the First World War for completely different reasons, she leaves and she takes another job someplace else. But she's the special features writer for the Call, and she's covering issues that are very similar to things that we still have today. In one case, it's a different world. In another case, it's very much the same world that we lived in. But the main point I want to get across is that she was not just this old woman helping poor people or helping the homeless or something, or lobbying against or protesting against the Vietnam War. She is a young woman deeply involved with the most important issues of the 20th century. At 19 years old, she is interviewing Leon Trotsky, who 9 months later or 8 months later is instrumental in the Bolshevik takeover of the Russian Revolution, which is what we've suffered through for, the Russian people suffered through it for 70 years. And she knew who Leon Trotsky was. It wasn't something that was just assigned by the editor to interview this guy, and she goes in and with 5 minutes preparation. When she was in high school, she was in an English composition course, and the teacher had asked everyone to write a short story, and so she wrote a short story about Russian revolutionaries in prison in Siberia, which not a lot of people at 14 years old were aware of this type of thing. But she was she was very much involved in what was going on in the world, very interested. She had multiple, and there's a whole chapter on her interview with Leon Trotsky in the book, because it was only one article, but they talk about things that really we don't know, we don't remember anymore. So I filled that out with some context. There's another chapter on her multiple interviews with Margaret Sanger, and the whole idea of birth control was new, and in New York State it was against the law. Margaret Sanger and her sister opened a birth control information center in someplace in Brooklyn. I can't remember the neighborhood, but it was in Brooklyn here. And they both got arrested. Margaret Sanger's sister went on trial first, and she went to jail she had a 30-day jail term. She decided to go on a hunger strike, and no woman had ever gone on a hunger strike in the United States. So Dorothy Day was the principal reporter covering Margaret Sanger's sister in jail on her hunger strike. She was getting all the information from Margaret Sanger. And so this was going into her report. She had 7 or 8 articles with her byline on this whole issue. Later in 1917, November 1917, she goes on a hunger strike herself, and she realizes, and of the 31 women who were going on hunger strike for suffrages, women's suffrage in Washington, 31 went on the hunger strike. Only 7 or 8 actually persevered to the end, Dorothy Day being one of them. And so she got the full experience of what it is to be on a hunger strike. And she realized that Margaret Sanger and her sister were lying. I mean, that Margaret Sanger's sister had been getting food from someplace, because she was much more healthy than Dorothy Day was, much more stronger than Dorothy Day was at the end of that 7 days. So anyway, she has this personal experience with these people who have such a big influence on the 20th century. So it's not some, woman off in the corner with, odd ideas. I mean, so one of her main issues was this commitment to peace and nonviolence. All of the socialists were suggesting a nonviolent solution to the German aggression. And when you look back on it, it's kind of an interesting way of looking at how we should handle this problem with the Germans. But nobody wanted to, the main thrust of society, of what they called the capitalist press, the business interests, they had no interest in finding a peaceful solution to this German aggression. So they were dead set on getting into this war. And one thing that Dorothy Day and her friends were aware of, and I mentioned friends because I've done a lot of research into who she was hanging around with and what they thought and what they wrote and that sort of thing. They were very much, they had different opinions, but there was a general agreement on some things. Dorothy Day and her friends were well aware of the war propaganda intensifying in 1916 and 1917 that dehumanized the enemy. And in order to get people to kill each other, you have to dehumanize them. So they were talking about the Huns, later on the commies, the Nazis, and that sort of thing. In this year of mercy, Pope Francis has been asking us to look at others with new eyes, without fear and without aggression. But this wasn't something that was in the ethos of this preparation for the war, except for this small group of socialists and pacifists. Now, I have my own experience on this because after growing up, hearing about our enemies behind the Iron Curtain, I had the opportunity in 1991 to go and live in what was then Czechoslovakia and became the Czech Republic shortly after I moved there. I like to say that I went to Czechoslovakia and never came back because the country ceased to exist while I was there. But I had the opportunity to live in these lands after communism collapsed, and I found that these people had the same hopes from their family, the same concern for the future, and the same desire for peace as anyone else, I think anyone in the U.S. It was a real eye-opener, and it helped me quite a bit. Dorothy Day was also a woman of great courage and daring, and this comes out in a number of her articles in the Call. And her courage and daring was came out of this relentless use of her conscience. And our human dignity is founded on conscience. Our ability to sense the will of God and the freedom, the ability to carry out that will. So in the Our Father, we talk about, thy will be done on earth. Well, that's not some sort of thing for other people. That's, for me and you, that thy will be done. And she actually got interested in Christianity at an early age. Her parents didn't practice anything. She got interested in Christianity. She had herself baptized in the Episcopalian Church when she was 12. And by the time she was 16, she had already left what they called organized religion, because having become a Christian, she didn't find that Christians were actually living what she had been attracted to in the Gospels. The word of Jesus Christ, the life and the ideals of Jesus. And so at this point, she was still reading the New Testament, but she didn't consider herself a Christian because she wasn't associated with any particular church. But she had this idea that there was something that God wanted of her at every moment. And a fundamental corollary of conscience is the obligation to be formed in the truth. And one of the testimonies of one of her old friends, her Greenwich Village friends, after she died, was that Dorothy was always well respected for the intensity of her seeking. I think she kind of drove some of her friends a little bit crazy because she was always asking the next question, looking for the truth, trying to determine, what is the truth? What's the best way to behave? What's the best way to go forward? And she carried these convictions into her personal life. So she never compromised with her conscience. And you and I, if we look at it, if we look at our day carefully, we probably are compromising with the big ideals that we have and the way that we actually live minute by minute. We're doing that all the time. And I'm sure she was doing the same thing. But what comes through in her life is that real faithfulness to, when she saw something that, being driven by her conscience. I wanted to move quickly through a couple of things that she experienced in the Call while she was working for the Call. These are slides, these are cartoons by a fellow named Ryan Walker, who joined the Call about the same time. These two cartoons are about a strike in Bayonne, which she covered as a reporter, and so they were working together. She was on the streets of Bayonne while the strike was going on, It was the Standard Oil Company against the workers. Well, the workers went on strike. The New York Times depicted it as a worker riot, that the workers had taken control of all of Bayonne and they were shooting indiscriminately. And actually what was happening is it was exactly the opposite. The police were actually shooting people indiscriminately with machine guns. And what comes out here, and this is just as true in Dorothy Day's writings as in Ryan Walker's cartoons, is that he puts Jesus there giving his message, and then everything being contradicted by the powers that are in play. What's the next one? Go to the next one. She was also involved. One of the big issues was food prices, because World War I going on in Europe, the European War, farmers were shipping their goods directly to the war country, the Allies, because they were paying higher prices for the crops. So whatever was left over for the people in New York was extremely expensive. And you know, you have a large part of the population is just surviving month to month, and then all of a sudden the food prices are going up 50, 70%, 100%, and they couldn't, you know, mothers couldn't afford nutritious food for their children. And so they had these demonstrations in front of City Hall. Now they call it Starving Women Before City Hall. The New York Times and the New York World were describing this as riots, you know, food riots of these crazed women. But the fact is that their families were starving, and they were looking for some recourse to that. What's the next one? Oh, and then, of course, peace. This is one of the iconic photographs. This photograph on the cover, it was done at the same time, but you can see that it's a different pose. It's a little bit nicer, but it was done a number of times. But this is February 10th, 1917, and this this headline, which is also on this one, but it's cut off, is "Down with War, Long Live Peace, Pledge of 4,000 at Great Meeting." And this was the socialist meeting where they laid out their proposal for a peaceful solution to German aggression. Dorothy Day carried on her commitment to peace by objecting. Well, she went down to Washington just before the war was declared. She came back and worked against the draft. It was the first draft that had been legislated since the Civil War, and people really felt that it was unconstitutional for the government to take people against their will. What's the next one? Next one. Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, and this is an attack on the call. So she went to Washington. The call was well known for being against the war. She went to Washington to promote, well, actually, it was because she went as a reporter with other people who were promoting peace. When she gets back, some thugs come in and ransack her newspaper, The Call. And these are all people that, this is the same Ryan Walker, and she's up there. So she was present at this persecution of people who were trying to find peaceful solutions. The next one is, she went, Her next job was at the Masses. It was a radical journal, and that was closed down by the government for speaking out against the war. And she went to prison under this hunger strike, more because because the suffragists were being treated as criminals, and her friends who had avoided the draft were being treated as criminals. And in Europe, people who get arrested for political messages are considered political prisoners, and they're given rights that are more generous than a common criminal. But in this country, you're a criminal. And so this is why she actually joined the suffragists in Occoquan. A couple months later, she had the experience of a friend of hers, Ernest Gellert, who had registered. So the draft was called. You were supposed to register for the draft, and if you were called, then you were supposed to serve. So some of her friends didn't register for the draft, and they were criminal, and a lot of them went to Mexico. Some of her friends registered for the draft and were drafted. One of those was this Ernst Gellert, and he said that I don't want to do anything. Once he was in the army, he said I don't want to do anything that would kill somebody, and they locked him up as in solitary confinement. And a few months later, he was found dead with a bullet in his head. So the resistance to anyone who spoke out against the war was actually quite powerful. Okay, I should conclude here. I want to send out, give 3 proposals for promoting peace through our own lives. And it's not a matter of carrying posters or protests or getting arrested. If you want to do that, it's probably a special calling. But there's 3 things that everybody can do in order to promote peace. One is have an eye for others. And I titled my book An Eye for Others because even at 19, she's concerned about the things that affect other people and how to correct the wrongs in our society. And we are all brothers. Jesus dies on the cross for everyone, and yet powerful forces try to separate us. We have to beware of the talk of government politicians about who our friends are and our enemies, the good guys and the bad guys. So, again, but Jesus died on the cross for everyone. We ought to ask Jesus for a heart as big as his. The next time you ride on the subway, think that Jesus died for everyone on his car. And you could actually make it a prayer. Jesus, you died for everyone on this car. That's amazing. It's something to think about. The second thing is develop virtue. As Christians, we're called to behave as children of God, God's own children. And that's a call to virtue, to good behavior. So look for truth. Promote the truth. Don't promote falsehood. Dorothy Day promoted whatever she was given from Margaret Sanger, even after it became, she had a strong suspicion that that the information was not correct. But her editors wanted to push the whole thing of birth control martyr. And so she went ahead and did that in her articles. But in her memoirs, she says that, I had a sense that I was distorting the truth, which is the name that I gave that chapter. Let's not distort the truth. One thing here is social media, and this election has been devoid of virtue, where it doesn't have to be. I mean, we should tweet as children of God. So when we send something out there, is this the way Jesus would tweet? I think it's important that we give that a lot of consideration, that we're polite and modest. We show our love of neighbor through this simple thing of the way we tweet. And I love Twitter, by the way. And then the third thing I wanted to propose is that there are nonviolent solutions to big problems. Dorothy Day separated from her communist friends precisely on this point of nonviolence, because they were promoting a violent revolution. But she found the words later on that portrayed her own feeling about it, a revolution of the heart. And as she put it, the greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution which has to start with each one of us. So this is something to look at. And again, going back to Dorothy Day's example, she had a really bad temper. And she would get really outraged when she saw injustices, people being people's human dignity being offended in various ways. And she was very sensitive to how human dignity is offended. And it would get her mad. But she learned to control her temper. And this is something that we need to, if we're going to have nonviolent solutions to problems, we need to control our temper. So when your sister laughs at your haircut, find a nonviolent solution, so that when she cracks up your car, you'll be used to finding nonviolent solutions to small problems, really. So when we learn to do that, we can also demand that from others, politicians, for instance, to find nonviolent solutions to the world's problems. But last thing I wanted to say was that we're called to do this in our own way. Dorothy Day had a very special calling from God to do something that was all her own. But in one of the primary documents of the Second Vatican Council reads that the laity, by their very vocation, seek the kingdom of God by engaging in temporal affairs and by ordering them according to the plan of God. So every career, every line of work ought to be a contribution to God's work of creation. This is something we can keep in mind every day. It begins with personal conversion and prayer, and it's expressed in action, engaging in temporal affairs and ordering them according to the plan of God, which is a peaceful plan. So these are some lessons for a more peaceful world that we can learn from Dorothy Day. So if you have any questions. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is that I heard that a number of you are in public health, and Dorothy Day she left the call, and then the federal government closed down the masses that she was working for. And in April of 1918, the war was going on. She became not a nurse, but an assistant to a nurse in King's Hospital here in Brooklyn. And while she was there, they had we all experienced, the world experienced this flu epidemic that killed so many people. And in her ward, she was experiencing like 8 people a day dying from this flu. And so I just mention this because this kind of full experience, the human experience that Dorothy Day had as a 19, 20-year-old, it covered just this multitude of issues that were out there at the day. So there's plenty of issues that confront us all right now. We have to find a way to tackle those, particularly in our careers, that we work for justice in our careers. And so Dorothy Day is a great example of that. It's hard to say just women, because I'm not a woman, and I'm not thinking in that direction. I think that, we're all, complementary, and we've got to treat each other, we all treat each other well. I think just looking for the right thing to do in every moment is always the best thing, whether it's a woman or a man. There's been examples of poor behavior by men during the election, and I think that it's a lesson to all of us that we don't want to behave that way. So, and if men behave better to women, I think that's a great contribution to women. She was bold. She was determined. She was the first woman in the call to have her own byline. They had articles before her, because I've looked at the call going back before she joined. And they would have a byline by a girl reporter or a woman reporter or something like, without the name. She was the first one to have her name in the byline, so it's a real accomplishment. And I don't think, and I think the call was well ahead of the New York Times and New York World and the other big ones at that time. Well, I wouldn't agree either. I mean, I think, and from Dorothy Day's perspective, she didn't think there was anything just about the war. But let me leave it at that, because I have a whole different talk prepared on just what Dorothy Day and her friends went through, the pressures that were involved with anyone who was against World War I, and the pressures that the government was bringing to bear on all these people. And they passed the Espionage Act of 1917, closed down a number of 2,000 publications that spoke out against the war, and arrested many people. And it was a very difficult time.